my Lord Lieutenant, Mr. Deputy Mayor, Councillor Jed Potter, and our honoured guests who are joining us today here at Littleover Methodist Church. We do want to say right at the beginning that we are recording this evening, and we hope to put this out at a later date. If you are uncomfortable with being recorded, then you're unlikely to be filmed or recorded unless you are up on the platform. If you are on the platform, I think we've checked with everyone, they're okay with it. If you are a bit uncomfortable about photography as well, we have a photographer walking around getting some photographs. Again, do alert him if you aren't comfortable with that. You're very welcome to be here. We're privileged and delighted to have you here. My name is Chris Briggs. I'm the minister here at Littleover Methodist Church, and also something called a mission enabler for the Nottingham and Derby district of the Methodist Church. And this is the launch event for Christianity Month 2024, which will run throughout May. If you decide that you wish to ask a question of the panel after the break that we'll have, you will see there are some slips of paper on your tables. We've even pushed the budget a bit and put a pen or two on there as well. If you want to ask a question, please write as legibly as you can and put down your question, preferably in a short form, and put down your name as well. During the break, I will assess which questions we can ask, and we'll try to get through a goodly number of them, although we can't guarantee all of them. And the way that will work is, during the break, if you can get your question to the front to this table as quickly as possible, then I'll have a few minutes to sort out which questions we can ask during the interval. So I'm pleased that on various points you'll see on this platform the Right Honourable Sir Stephen Timms, who is Member of Parliament for East Ham, my birthplace, by the way, so that's great. Okay, well, it probably wasn't as good as I hoped for, but and also where West Ham United will be playing. Oh, right, thank you. Shame, I've got my West Ham socks on. Yes, so Sir Stephen is also chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. He's held a number of ministerial posts over the years. He's also played a role in working with different faith groups as the Labour Party's faith envoy. He came to faith at a tent mission run by a small gospel hall in Forest Gate, London, some 40 years ago. And Sir Stephen is our keynote speaker this evening, and he'll also take part in our expert panel for a question and answer session, and I've mentioned how you can submit a question for that. He'll be joined on the panel by Joe Howie, who is our pioneer missioner for the Methodist Church at Susanna Wesley House in Derby, and also by the Reverend Andy File, who is the chair of district of the Nottingham and Derby district of the Methodist Church. So let me explain how the evening will unfold. In a moment, I'll invite Sir Stephen to deliver his keynote address. After that, we'll have something like a 15-minute or so break as a comfort break, but also you can eat a little bit more, get some tea and coffee, whatever you'd like to do. On your tables, there are the sheets that I've mentioned, so you need to fill those in and get those to the front. It might be you have a question under several names, or it might just be one name. Then we will convene our panel, and depending on how many questions we have, we'll allow 30 to 45 minutes for this. Please bear in mind, questions should relate to what Sir Stephen has shared with us or to the general theme of the evening. So if they're not relating or linked to the theme, I probably won't take them, to be honest. So please concentrate on that as well. This is the launch of Christianity Month, as I mentioned, and we will have lots of events going on here as well as in other churches in May. And there's information about that on your table. You'll find a compilation leaflet. You might want to take one of those away with you. And indeed, if you want to, some of them are ticketed events. If you want to buy any tickets tonight or put your name down for anything, then do see me and I'll point you in the right direction this evening as well. Christianity Month is about celebrating the rich contribution that the Christian faith has made to this country and indeed all over the world. And it's not just about this church, as I've mentioned, it's about spreading it further and further. So thank you for being one of those attending this event. And now it's my pleasure and privilege to invite Sir Stephen Timms to give our keynote address this evening. Is the Christian faith relevant to politics, community and society? Would you please welcome him?
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I'm delighted to be here. It's a privilege to be at the launch of Christianity Month, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to the Lord Lieutenant, to the Deputy Mayor and Deputy Mayor's Consort for being here. Good luck in the mayoral election next month, if I'm allowed to say that. And Parliamentary Convention requires me to inform the local MP that I'm visiting and speaking in her constituency, so I sent Amanda Soloway a message and had a very nice response from her, and I'm delighted that Catherine Atkinson, the prospective Labour candidate for the constituency, is with us tonight. You might wonder what my qualifications are for being here. I studied maths at university. I started my working life in the computer industry, but this year I have been the MP for East Ham, for Chris's birthplace, for 30 years. It's in Newham, in the East End of London. Before that, I was a local councillor in the area, as Clef, who's here, knows, because Clef stood against me in one of those elections. Oh, there she is, right. That was 1986, that must have been, I reckon. Is that right? Yeah. Well, I won that election, I'm pleased to say. I remember very early on, I was first elected in 1984, I was rung up at home by somebody from a different part of the borough who told me her problem with some rubbish in her garden. And I couldn't work out why she'd rung me. I wasn't the local councillor for that area. I wasn't involved particularly in rubbish collection. And I tried to explain politely that I wasn't the right person to speak to. And she said, "Oh, but you're always in the local paper talking a lot of rubbish. So I thought you were the right person for the job." So I'll try and do a bit better this evening. But one of my friends is the Labour life peer, Maeve Sherlock. She came to public attention first as president of the National Union of Students at the end of the 1980s, and then as chief executive of what was then called the National Council for One-Parent Families, now called Gingerbread. Before 2003, she worked at the Treasury as one of the special advisors to Gordon Brown, working on issues like child poverty and welfare reform. And from 1999 to 2001, for those 2 years, I was a minister at the Treasury, and that was when we met, and we worked together on some of those projects. In 2003, Maeve left the Treasury, and she became chief executive of the Refugee Council. And her job entailed visiting projects supporting refugees all over the country. And she told me later what had happened. As she visited all these projects, it quickly became clear to her that the most extraordinary ones, often involving really sacrificial levels of care by volunteers, that these were all run by churches or by Christian groups. Nobody had told her that that was going to be the case, or warned her that she was going to come off these slightly odd people, religious people, when she was doing it, and she was puzzled by it. So she decided she needed to find a bit more out about Christianity. She noticed that a church near where she lived was running something called an Alpha course, and she decided to attend that, and in due course, through that, she came to faith herself. Since 2010, she's been a member of the House of Lords. In 2018, she was ordained a deacon in the Church of England, and she now somehow combines her heavy workload on the opposition front bench in the House of Lords with being the non-stipendiary associate vicar of St. Nicholas's Church in central Durham. And I wanted to tell you about Maeve's experience, because what I want to suggest this evening is that with things in the country in such a depressing state in so many ways. So many things apparently not working as they should do. What I see is more and more people looking to the churches and what's happening in the churches and finding something different there than they find elsewhere, something more hopeful. And I think that's an important development in our history. And it's the key to the relevance of the Christian faith to today's politics. I'm not from a church-going family. I've been a Christian since my teens, actually before I went to Forest Gate. But growing up, as I did in the 60s and the 70s, it was pretty clear that religious faith was on the way out. Yes, there were a fair number of elderly people who still believed, but really we were growing out of all these old-fashioned superstitions. And it was just a matter of time before the elderly churchgoers were gone and it would all be over. And a lot of people still think that. Newspapers publish regular statistics that church attendance has fallen again. The latest census showed that for the first time, fewer than half of people in Britain describe themselves as Christians. You know, the trend looks pretty clear. And yet, I don't think those statistics tell us what is really happening. Certainly, looking back at the pandemic, we get a very, very different picture. Just after lockdown began in 2020, Good Friday that year, I was sitting at home after what I claimed was a tiring parliamentary session and going through some unread emails. And there were 2 emails that morning from constituents saying, I don't have enough food for the Easter bank holiday weekend, what should I do? And I didn't know how to answer them. I've become very used in the last few years to referring people to food banks, but I thought that over the Easter bank holiday weekend, they probably wouldn't be open. But looking further back through my emails, there was one from the directly elected mayor of Newham, Roxana Fiaz, and her email said, if you find people without enough food over this weekend, send an email to the Vicar of Ascension Church in the Royal Docks before 10 in the morning, and he'll arrange for a food parcel to be delivered before 6 p.m. that evening. Now, 25 years earlier, I was the leader of Newham Council, doing the job that the elected mayor now does. At that time, we were polite to the churches, but we never worked with them as partners. And the mayor's suggestion that this arrangement had been, it sounded frankly a bit implausible to me, but I didn't have any better ideas, so I thought I'd better give hers a try. And both my constituents received their food parcels later on that Good Friday. And as the weeks went on, I saw that very large numbers of people, many of whom in our very multiracial community had never set foot in a church in their lives before, had become dependent for the most basic requirements of life on the churches and people in the churches. In Parliament, I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society. And seeing what was happening in the pandemic, we commissioned Goldsmiths, University of London, to carry out some research. They sent a questionnaire to every council in the UK about cooperation with faith groups during the pandemic. About half the councils replied, and their replies made it clear that what I'd seen in my borough was in fact happening in every part of the country, cities, towns, rural areas as well. The report of the research was published in November 2020 under the title Keeping the Faith. You can find it on the website of our all-party parliamentary group. Local councils have long been quite nervous about working with faith groups. They've been worried that if, like other voluntary organisations, they commissioned faith groups to deliver services, then one of 2 things would go wrong. Either the faith group would use the funds to try and convert people instead of delivering the service, or the service would be delivered but biased in favour of members of that particular group. Working with faith groups, from the point of view of council officers, it just seems too difficult and complicated. If you work with this group here, aren't you going to offend that other group over there? And let's be honest, the people involved in these things are quite odd. They believe in God. You know, you've got to, far simpler to give it all a wide berth and find somebody else less complicated to work with. But come the pandemic, there wasn't anybody else. Councils didn't start working with faith groups at that time because they thought it would be nice to do so. They did it because they had no choice. The faith groups had the premises and the volunteers and the connections with people needing help that nobody else had. There just wasn't anyone else to take on the job. It wasn't just churches, it was other faith groups as well, but of course it was churches who did the lion's share. And that was true also in my very multi-faith borough, where according to the census, the proportion describing themselves as Christians is the lowest in the country. So our survey reported the reflections of council officers around the country on working with faith groups in the pandemic. Many of them were extremely surprised what a positive experience it turned out to be. The anticipated problems, that people were just going to try and convert people or be biased in favour of their group, those didn't register at all. But the strengths of churches and faith groups, credibility through long-standing presence in the community, as here in Littleover, availability of enthusiastic volunteers, access to hard-to-reach and most disadvantaged groups, those were key to getting communities intact through the worst of the pandemic. And one of the council officers told the researcher, and I quote, "My personal admiration for faith groups has gone through the roof just in terms of their commitment there. We as a local authority didn't know what we were getting into, and they've got involved with smiles on their faces, and they've done it professionally." And he was speaking, I think, for the experience of many, many councils around the country of what happened in the pandemic. Far from being on the way out, it turned out that when, in this decade, the crunch came, communities became completely dependent on their churches. No one else had both the motivation and the capacity to do what was needed. And what we learned in the pandemic, I think, was that if you want to change things for the better in Britain today, if you want to find resources that can give communities hope in the face of all the challenges we're facing, then counterintuitive as it will seem to some, you should look to the churches. In our history, we're all very familiar with the fact that schools, hospitals, great charities were started by churches or by people in churches. But that was history. It's different today. Or is it? New church-based initiatives started to appear on the radar, I think in a big way, with the food banks of the Trussell Trust. As austerity started to bed in from 2010, more and more people, as we all know, found they couldn't afford to buy enough food from the shops, so they turned to food banks. The number of food banks grew very rapidly. All the Trussell Trust food banks were based on a church. There are other food banks as well outside the Trussell Trust. There's a thing called the Independent Food Aid Network, which networks most of the rest of them, but most of them are church-based as well. The combination, capacity and motivation to help, uniquely shown by churches. Now, I was not a supporter of austerity policies. I would have preferred it if the churches hadn't had to do what they did, but they did have to, and thank goodness for the contribution that they have made. In the run-up to the 2010 general election, David Cameron, wanting to make the case for reducing the role of the state, talked about the big society. And in many ways, the Trussell Trust exemplified that idea. But the problem for the government was that the Trussell Trust didn't just hand out food parcels, they also collected data on how many they were handing out and the reasons the people they were handing them out to needed them. And that really annoyed ministers. That wasn't what they envisaged as the big society. That was churches interfering in the work of government. For a long time, Ian Duncan Smith, the then Secretary of State, wouldn't speak to the Trussell Trust because he was so annoyed with what they were saying. And in the end, I had to stand up in Prime Minister's Questions and ask David Cameron if he would meet the Trussell Trust. And to his great credit, I thought, he said he would, and he was as good as his word, and he did. The food banks of the Trussell Trust, with others, should never have been needed, but they were, and a huge debt of gratitude is owed to all those who volunteer in them. Another extraordinary, more recent church-based endeavour with, I think, huge positive impact is called Christians Against Poverty. Some of you may have come across it. It was founded in Bradford in 1996 by John Kirby, who had himself experienced crippling debt, but also had long experience in the financial services industry. And what they do is that they train up volunteers in churches as debt counsellors, then provide support to people in debt through teams based in churches. The volunteers are supported by a huge back office in Bradford. I was there when they dedicated their new building a couple of years ago. And that negotiates on behalf of individual clients with banks and others to whom the debts are owed. And they do a very impressive job, supporting a very large number of people to get on top of seemingly impossible personal debts, and also providing really valuable analysis of why people are getting trapped in debt in such large numbers in the first place. John Kirby himself retired from Christians Against Poverty a couple of years ago. He's concentrating now on evangelistic work. But I, as you've heard, chair in Parliament the Work and Pensions Select Committee, which scrutinises on behalf of Parliament the policies and practices of the Department for Work and Pensions. And often, when we want to speak to people on the sharp end of the social security system to find out what it's actually like, we ask the Trussell Trust or Christians Against Poverty to put us in touch, because working from their churches, they are in touch with exactly the people we need to hear from. They've got the trust of the people we need in our committee to hear from in a way that is very, very rare. Just a word about this assumption that really people in churches are running food banks or supporting homeless people or doing all these things in the hope of converting people. It's an understandable assumption, but I think it very seriously misunderstands what is really motivating all the people who are doing all of these things. And there are a good number of people this evening who are doing them, who are here. They're people whose lives have been changed by the good news brought by Jesus Christ, who find that out of gratitude, in response, they want to give to others. What is really going on, what I thought was very well described by Tom Wright, the former Bishop of Durham, in his book, Surprised by Hope. And he put it like this: people who believe in the resurrection, in God making a whole new world in which everything will be set right at last, are unstoppably motivated to work for that new world in the present. And just read that again. People who believe in the resurrection, in God making a whole new world in which everything will be set right at last, are unstoppably motivated to work for that new world in the present. The people who are doing all these things have found in their faith that they want, in gratitude to God, to help make things better for others. If the others come to faith too, that's great, but that isn't the reason for doing it. People with no religious interest or commitment can see that something good is happening. And MPs like me, looking around our constituencies for developments which are positive and offer hope for the future, can see that what's happening in the churches is often the most promising of all. I think that's why attendance at the annual National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, held in the Houses of Parliament, continues to increase. I've been going to them for a long time. They were pretty desultory events when I started to attend them 30 years ago. Today, Westminster Hall in the Houses of Parliament is packed for the event. It's usually in June, starting at 7:30 in the morning. Very large numbers of members of Parliament attend, including often the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The successful formula for increasing attendance has been to ask church members to attend and to invite their own MPs to attend as well. And MPs are impressed by what they see the church is doing. They want to keep a good relationship, so large numbers of MPs accept that invitation each year. At the National Prayer Breakfast in 2022, the speaker was Les Isaac. Born in Antigua, he was a Rastafarian as a young man, involved in gangs in London before becoming a Christian. He was the founder 20 years ago in Brixton of Street Pastors, a response to the rise of gun and knife crime, and another of these remarkable church-based initiatives changing communities for the better. In this one, volunteers based in churches make themselves visible in city centres late at night and in the small hours so that people who are drunk or at risk for some other reason can get some ready help, a bottle of water or some flip-flops to put on their feet or something to walk safely to the station and so get home safely. Now, who else would do that in Britain today other than people from the churches? In his sermon at the National Prayer Breakfast in June 2022, Les Isaac said this: "At the centre of our lives is Jesus and a desire to be like him and to fulfill his purpose here on earth. Many men and women are quietly demonstrating service, humbly and compassionately, for the common good of the community, of society, of their city and their nation." Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, was in the prayer breakfast, but he had to leave early. But amongst the MPs who stayed to hear that talk was Sajid Javid, who at that time was the Health Secretary. Later that day, he resigned from the government. And he said it was listening to that talk by Les Isaac, those words about integrity in public service, that made him jump. And as you'll remember, about 50 other ministers followed Sajid Javid's lead. Boris Johnson eventually had to resign. But that struck me as a pretty dramatic example of Christian faith having an impact on politics. And, you know, the fact that we ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, I think tells you quite a lot about the situation the country has got itself into. My observation of him, obviously I don't know him well, but I've observed him in Parliament. I think he's a very clever man of great talent. It looked to me as if he thought hard about what to say in any given situation. But in deciding what to say, the criterion, is this true, did not appear to be a major consideration. I don't think he set out to lie to people. I don't think that was his intention at all. But it was just that in choosing his words, there were more important matters to take into account than whether they were true. And you know that I think that's not unusual, and it's not just in this country we've seen that happening. But I think it's a reflection of the difficulties that we find ourselves in, and you know why there is such little confidence, frankly, in politics today. In his 1976 book, The Call to Seriousness, which I read not long after it was published, the historian Ian Bradley showed how Britain was transformed by the evangelical awakening of the late 18th and early 19th century, spearheaded by the preaching of John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. And everything about how the country worked was changed by that phenomenon. And Ian Bradley puts it like this, quoting another historian, Harold Perkin, who wrote, "Between 1780 and 1850, the English ceased to be one of the world's most aggressive, rowdy, outspoken, cruel, and bloodthirsty nations, and became one of the most inhibited, polite, orderly, and tender-minded." He also added a couple of further adjectives to his list, which were prudish and hypocritical. But I've missed them out, because what I want to emphasise, it seems to me that transformation was a really positive change that this country experienced. And I think the state we are in now requires another awakening of a similar scale and along the same lines. And I'm one of those who thinks it could happen and hopes that it will. And I think that unstoppable motivation of those people who believe in the resurrection may well be the key to bringing that about. What about the complaint that Christians are only doing all these things in order to convert people? Well, actually, as far as we can tell, not many of the beneficiaries of the food banks and the debt advice and so on are themselves coming to faith. But people are coming to faith as a result of these initiatives in a rather different way. There was a very interesting piece of research from the think tank Theos, which looked at what is happening in all of these projects. And they found that not all that many beneficiaries of food banks and so on do make faith commitments for themselves. But what is much more common is that others in the community see what the church is doing, welcome it as a good thing, and offer to help out, having never been interested in Christianity before, and they're the ones who end up coming to faith for themselves rather than those on whom the help is targeted. That seems to be the mechanism through which people are coming to faith through all of these things. You know, such a lot of what's happening in Britain seems so discouraging. So much seems to be broken. But people look at what's happening in the churches and they are encouraged. They see their grounds for optimism about the future. Here are good things emerging: kindness, thoughtfulness, benefiting strangers and all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds. And people want to be part of that and to help. And I hope we're going to see even more of that in the future. I hope more people fed up with the meanness and the selfishness and the self-centeredness which characterizes so much of our national life, including our politics. I hope people will see in what the churches are doing something different, much more positive, much more hopeful. And that they'll also want to find out what it is which is making these people different, is causing them to act with kindness and thoughtfulness, and will discover that it is that they believe in Jesus Christ and in his resurrection. And that having learned that they will inquire further, as Maeve Sherlock did, about these Christian beliefs which seem increasingly out of step with modern thinking in so many ways, and that they will then come to conclude that those Christian beliefs are true and will make a Christian commitment of their own. Because believing changes everything. It changes the way we think about everything, the assumptions which underpin our choices and our actions, the way we relate to others, the things we say to people. And that is the key, I believe, to bringing about the transformation which Derby is crying out for and the country is crying out for as well. And I hope that having realised that, some of those people will want not just to get involved in supporting those who are struggling in their local communities, vital though that is, but also to apply this new way of looking at things, this unstoppable motivation to political service, so that it starts to transform politics as well, helps to renew trust and confidence in politics, restore the confidence that democratic politics is morally legitimate and can deliver for people in Britain as we face all these complex challenges ahead. That's how I see Christian faith being relevant, massively relevant to politics, to community, and to society. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to settle this out to you this evening. I'll be very happy to have a go at answering any questions you might choose to write down in the next couple of minutes, or indeed about anything else in the discussion we're about to have. Thank you all very much.
So, Let's start off with this one. Janet Tristram. Can you give us a wave, Janet? From where? Thank you, Janet. Thank you for this. Going to start off with Joe, because I know Joe will love this. So, Joe, hot from Susanna Wesley House in Derby. But we will ask all three. How much should Christians be motivated with God's heart for justice and peace? How much should Christians be motivated with God's heart for justice and peace? Joe?
I think that's really tricky to answer, because it's kind of, it's not formulaic to kind of say these types of things. It's very personal, I think, how God motivates us individually. And if he motivated us all in the same way, then really I think it'd be kind of very narrow, the impact we'd be having. And so I think it is really individual how we're motivated. And I think for some people, it's to do with capacity as well. People have families, elderly relatives they look after. Perhaps you're living with a disability. And I think God takes that into the equation, really. And I think we're motivated, certainly, but we also have to do that within our capability. And so for some people, that's maybe something really simple, like connecting with our neighbour, reaching out to someone really local to us. And that's just as important as some of the bigger things we hear about people starting charities and amazing projects. If we're impacting one person's life, I think we're doing God's will. I don't know if that's...
Thank you. Can I push that a bit further and just say, are you able to share anything of what you feel motivates you?
Yeah, so particularly what motivates me in my work at Susanna Wesley House is very much Jesus' life and how he always saw the least, how he always took notice of those people on the margins and the fringes of society, very much overlooked, but not just overlooked, kind of, disregarded, treated appallingly. And he never neglected those people. He totally welcomed them in. And we live with these people around us, don't we, who are kind of ostracized by society. And I feel, for me in my faith, it feels hugely important to follow Jesus' example and to welcome people, to welcome all people, regardless of who they are. And that, for me, is my motivation.
Thank you, Joe. Reverend Andy File, Chair of the Nottingham and Derby Methodist District. Andy, how much should Christians be motivated with God's heart for justice and peace?
Thank you for the question. I think Joe's covered it really well. I'd want to say about God's heart for justice and peace is a godly heart for all of us to know that justice and peace in our lives. It's how we live it out personally that makes all the difference. A quote went through my mind as I was listening to Joe answer a quote from John Wesley, who said, "Go not just to those who need you, but those who need you most." So it's about discerning where God is at work in your heart and life to use your gifts to make a difference to others. And in that way, you will be living a just life, and you will be bringing peace to those who you're called to serve.
Thank you. And Stephen, how much should Christians be motivated with God's heart for justice and peace?
Well, I think it is an inescapable part of the package, a very important part of the package, and as we read the Bible, that I think is very clear. I mean, I think the heart of the Christian walk is worship of God, faith in Christ, and that expresses itself in our attitudes and how we relate to other people, and wanting to see peace and justice is just part of what comes out of that. And the thing that I'm really encouraged by, as I was saying earlier, is just how much of that we're seeing in churches at the moment in a really practical way, in a way that's making it really clear why faith is so important in a way which I can sometimes think we've forgotten, or people have forgotten. But today, it's really, really clear.
Thank you very much indeed. So our next question comes from Andy Smith. Can we have a wave from Andy? Thank you very much. How can Christianity be more relevant to those not on the margins in the workplace, for instance? So how can Christianity be more relevant to those not on the margins in the workplace, for instance? Andy, would you like to have a go at that, as your namesake has offered that?
Indeed. How can Christianity be more relevant is a really good question anyway. Those of us who see Christ as Lord and seek to follow his example and live out the love of God through following his way want the Christian faith to be relevant. I think we can live out our lives in such a way that expresses our joy in God that we find through how we are. For me, one of the most important things is to be authentic as God's people. And in the way that we live, it makes a difference to what people see about the Christian faith. If we live it well, if we live out our example as we see it in Christ, as we offer Christ's love in the ways that we can, not the ways that we can't, we will see how the Christian faith becomes more and more relevant to more and more people around us, wherever we are, whether that's in the workplace or anywhere else. So I think it's about how we live out our Christian faith ourselves.
Thanks, Andy. Stephen, so how can Christianity be more relevant to those not on the margins?
Well, I've got a bit of an inside track here because I had a conversation with Andy in the break. And I'd be saying that Andy works at Rolls-Royce, and Rolls-Royce very recently got an award as the best employer in the FTSE 100 for supporting people wanting to express their faith at work. And, you know, I think that's great. I'm involved with a thing called Christians in Parliament, which is for MPs and lots of other people who work in Parliament. There's a service once a week. There are other activities. And, I think if there are things in which we can express and share our faith in the context of the workplace, that is great. And I think perhaps there is, as this award suggests, a growing awareness on the part of employers that it is important for people of faith to be able to express their faith and not having to hide it or be ashamed of it or rather furtive about it when they're at work, but to make it clear it's a key part of our identity, including in our workplace.
Thank you. And Joe, how can Christianity be more relevant to those not on the margins?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as a question, because I think very often we can kind of segregate faith and religion into this maybe thing we put in the corner. But I think God is concerned with, our whole lives. And so I think when it comes to things like how we think of ministry, I don't think that's just a church activity or just an activity the church, we should be thinking about within church. And actually, a number of years ago when I went to study theology, I had to do a vocations weekend. And it was for people exploring ordination. And when I was there, I felt God really clearly talking to me and saying, no, it wasn't for me, actually, and that I felt called to be a layperson and to be ministering out in the world, so to speak, not in the church. And I think all of us as Christians have a ministry, and for the large proportion of us, that isn't within a church context. And so I think sharing our faith in the workplace, it's not always about kind of evangelism as we see it in the traditional sense, but I think it's also about, being a light, being that presence, being the person our colleagues can turn to. And I think, faith isn't just for marginalised people, it's for everyone, and God is for everyone.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to Hilary. Where's Hilary sitting? There we are, Hilary, towards the back. So faith communities seem to be picking up the pieces, plugging gaps caused by failed policy. How do we move from being a sticking plaster to having influence for more effective policies so food banks aren't needed? I'll just read that out again. Faith communities seem to be picking up the pieces, plugging gaps caused by failed policy. How do we move from being a sticking plaster to having influence for more effective policy so food banks aren't needed? Well, let's go back to Stephen for that. It resonates with some of that which you were saying.
Yes, I mean, I think what I'd really like to see is that lots of people who are getting involved in food banks and increasing against poverty and all these things that are going on, taking the kind of learning from that experience and coming into politics, joining political parties, standing for office, local councillors, members of parliament. And I think if that happens, then we will see politics transformed. I think we'll see new confidence in the ability of politics, because, you know, at the moment there's quite a big question: does democracy work? Is democracy the right way to run a society in 2024? Given that some societies elsewhere where there isn't a democracy seem to be doing better than we are. And I think if we're able to rebuild confidence in our politics because of the values that are being expressed in all these initiatives inside the political parties and inside political decision making, I think we will rebuild confidence, and I think we'll get better policies. So that's how I think we can do it.
Joe, I think you've seen a little bit about sticking plasters as well.
Gosh.
How do we move from being a sticking plaster to having influence for more effective policies?
I don't know the answer. In fact, it's an answer I'd love to know, because the more I work with asylum seekers, the more I get frustrated about not being, I guess, being able to make more of a difference, being able to, change things for the people I work with who are experiencing hardship. Someone did describe the work that we do at Susanna Risley House as first aid, and I something within me was kind of a bit affronted with that. But actually, I see that we are kind of there. It's almost a bit like an emergency service. We're there for people in crisis. But actually, I'd very much like to know how we can go about making more of a difference to policies. I think the more you kind of work in these situations, the more angry you get at about policies and how people are being treated kind of on the ground level, and to have the answers to do something about it would be amazing. I think certainly, the church, can be a powerful force, and I think, these conversations are really important for us to have as the church, and think about ways that we can influence.
Thank you. Andy's going to give us another part of that answer now. How do we move from sticking plaster to more effective policies?
Yeah, thank you. I want to say, I don't think it's a modern phenomenon. I think we've always lived with difficulties and problems in society, and the church has often been at the forefront of responding. Now, I speak as a Methodist minister, and the founder of the Methodist movement, John Wesley, was at the forefront of addressing social problems. He was at the factory gates, meeting those who were in poverty. He was there setting up schools for those who didn't have them back in the day, in the 18th century. So I don't think it's a new phenomenon. And I think the church has always been there to be the face of God's love in hope and care, offering practical response to need.
Thank you. Thank you. This one has a little bit of background to it. Colin Bond, where's Colin? Oh, thank you, Colin. Colin's a retired Baptist minister, and this involves the Muslim Council of Britain, which I think had its funding cut not so very long ago. So the question for Colin is, given the government's withdrawal of funding for the Interfaith Network in the light of the views of the Muslim Council of Britain, do you think this is short-sighted at this critical international time? So I think Stephen will probably be most up to date with this one.
Yeah, what's happened, and Colin's absolutely right, the government has withdrawn all the funding from the Interfaith Network. It was a very strange situation that at the beginning of last financial year, the government said it was taking the funding away from the Interfaith Network. And some of us complained, including me. I spoke to Michael Gove about it, and the funding was reinstated. They were told you'll have your funding for this year, for the financial year 23 to 24. But by January, the money hadn't appeared. And so I spoke to Michael Gove again, and eventually the Interfaith Network, I think in March this was, got a letter from the government saying, sorry, we're not going to give you the money for that financial year, which is more or less ended by then. And the Interfaith Network is going to shut down because they haven't got any... and the reason is, as Colin's question suggests, because one of the 22 trustees of the Interfaith Network is a representative of the Muslim Council of Britain. And the government, for quite a long time, has had a policy of not having anything to do with the Muslim Council for Britain. Now, for me, I think that's an ill-advised policy. I don't think that talking to people means you have to agree with everything they say, but there's no doubt at all the Muslim Council of Britain is a very broadly representative institution of Muslims in the UK, and the government does need to be talking to them. And to say that we're going to take away all the money for the Interfaith Network because one of the 22 has something to do with it, I thought, and to do it at this time when more than ever we need Muslim, Jewish, Christian dialogue, given what's happening in the Middle East, I thought was a terrible, terrible decision.
Thank you. And Andy or Joe, either of you want to add anything to that? Joe's declining, Andy?
I'm not sure I can add anything more in a really helpful way to what Sir Stephen has shared.
Can I just add one more thing, Chris? Because this question of working with other faiths is quite an important one, I think, at the moment. And I'm a Christian. People I know, a very large number of Muslims in my constituency, they believe something different to me. But very early on, when the previous MP for East Ham died, and the question was who was going to be the Labour candidate to take over, the first person who came to see me to say, we think you should go for this, was the chair of the Alliance of Newham Muslim Associations. And he said to me, we believe in God, you believe in God, we think you should go for this job. And that was a really important part of the reason. I mean, I said he was the first person who came to urge me to stand. He was, in fact, the only person who came to urge me. So, the fact that he did so was quite an important part of the reason that I ended up as a... So we believe different things, but the values are very much in common. And I think there's a really strong foundation there for people to work together from. And that's what I think the Interfaith Network has stood for.
Thank you. Andy, I think you wanted to add something.
I just wanted to agree with Sir Stephen and to say the importance of showing God's love to those who have other faith is as important as showing God's love to those who have no faith.
Thank you. Thank you for that important question. Well, they're all important, but thank you, because that's a bit more controversial than some. So we've got a question about trust now, and Catherine is Catherine. Trust in politics feels at an all-time low. How can we change that? So I think I'm going to leave Stephen till last on this one, because it's interesting. Often the trust is from those that perhaps aren't trying to do the political stuff. Not always, but let's start. Joe, are you happy to have a little go at that one? Trust in politics feels at an all-time low. How can we change that? Because you might not agree with the premise. So...
No, I think it probably is an accurate statement, and I think it would be really lovely to see those involved in politics, MPs in the local area, to really connect, be out on the ground, connecting with groups and really speaking to people. I think it really helps when people meet someone who is really interested in what's going on and genuinely wants to listen to people's problems, I guess. And it sounds so simple, doesn't it? And there isn't infinite amounts of time for one person for one person to do that. But I think people want to be seen and heard, and I think that's a really important part of trust.
Are you feeling people, maybe some in politics, are more detached and distant then, and that's part of the problem? Or is it about they don't do what they say?
Yeah, I guess...
Sweeping generalisations there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, working with asylum seekers, we can't expect people to be coming down from Parliament to just meet our clients and our guests. You know, okay, that's totally unrealistic. But to be more familiar with the issues that people are facing, to hear it firsthand. I think hearing things firsthand is really important. So getting, you know, more of an idea of the issues that people have, and I think that would go a really long way in earning trust.
Okay, thank you. Andy, is trust in politics at an all-time low, and how can we change it if it is?
I think that might well be a generally true statement. I was thinking as you were talking, Joe, when we have a lack of trust, how do we rebuild trust? That's the basic question. And it's a question in all of our lives, at many points of our lives, in different ways. I think engagement is the most important thing. And often I think people expect our MPs, our politicians to engage with us. But what about if we were to try and engage with them in a meaningful way and not expect it always to be one way? So I think there's a conversation, a communication issue going on in order that we might better understand and better trust one another.
And Stephen, you're looking at it from a very special place, aren't you? Do you think trust in politics is at an all-time low? And I guess that's not really a party political point at all, is it?
No, I think things are pretty rocky, and I think the point is that for politics to work and for people to have confidence in politics, it needs to be based on good values, and the problem is those values have been weakened. Responsibility, solidarity, patience, persistence, compassion, truthfulness. You need those values for politics to work, and if people can see those are the values which things are based on, then they'll be confident. If they can see they're not, then they lose confidence. So we need to renew those values, and that's another of the reasons why I'm so keen that people involved in all these things we've been talking about this evening get stuck into politics, because I think that, where do we see those values being instilled in Britain today? I think it's in the faith groups, and we need those people, we need those values to come into our politics so we can rebuild confidence.
Thank you, thank you. My next question comes from Susanna, who's sitting... Oh, I saw Susanna. Yes, Susanna's there. Do you think a time will come when it will be unacceptable to respectfully hold some of the more traditional Christian teachings? Do you think a time will come when it will be unacceptable to respectfully hold some of the more traditional Christian teachings? Andy, do you want to have a little go at that first?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and we're talking about maybe politics being broken. I think also maybe theology is broken within our churches to an extent. Our understanding of God is varied in the way that we approach it, but it's going to be, isn't it? Because we're all different and we're all different people. Will a time come when it will be unacceptable to hold respectfully those beliefs that are dear to us? I don't know the answer. Clearly I don't, because who does? But I think what is real and true is that we should, as Christian people, continue to live out the values that we see in our Lord Jesus Christ. And I don't think anyone can take that away from us. In Scripture it talks about the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness and self-control. Are not they the kind of values that we want to see in society, says Stephen? And are not they the things that we as Christians hold dear? And the writer of that letter says there is no law against these things. So I think if we live in that way, there will not come a time when it will be unacceptable.
Okay, so you did nail your colours to the mast in the end.
Yep.
Can't. Joe.
Oh, it is a difficult question, and yeah, one I guess we don't know the answer to, but I'm going to answer this as a mum to a 12-year-old. And actually, what I see in the younger generations is just a real acceptance, and it can go two ways, can't it? Being accepting, we can be really kind of, you know, we want to be really inclusive of all people. But from what I see in my daughter is just really accepting of everything. And so actually for people who hold very differing views to her own. And so that really gives me hope, actually, that we're not going to lose that from society, that in years to come, we will be able to be accepting of people if they have polar opposite views to our own, more so than now. So I think that just gives me hope that, you know, for those people with maybe more traditional Christian views, that there'll be a place for them too.
So hope for the future. And Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I agree with my fellow panelists. In the end, I think the answer is no. I don't think it is going to become, but with a couple of caveats. I mean, one is that, you know, if we look back 50, 100 years, there were probably widely held views which none of us now would support or think we should be part of, but which at the time, those who held them would say this was part of their Christian faith. So, you know, things do change, and I'm sure thinking will move on. And the other point is, I'm sure there will be lots of rows about this. I mean, we've had huge ructions around same-sex marriage, and, you know, there'll no doubt be more of that, and there'll no doubt be other things as well. But in the end, I think the answer to your question is no. That when these problems arise, we have to kind of work them through, and it can be very painful and difficult and take a long time, but we can do it. And I don't think we are going to find that things change to the extent that, you know, the fundamental Christian beliefs which are kind of illegal or cannot respectably be held. So no, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. In terms of, this is from Philip Brereton. Hello, Philip. In terms of politics and Christianity today, do you think that Westminster has a conscience? Especially with regard to the decisions made. It's really interesting, though, because if I may interject, I think conscience doesn't just come from individuals. I think there is a corporate level of conscience as well, personally, but the panellists may or may not agree with that. Obviously, all three panellists will answer it from a different perspective, but may have a view on it. So, Andy, in terms of politics and Christianity today, do you think that Westminster has a conscience with regard to decisions that are made?
Well, I mean, clearly, for me, clearly, the answer is yes, of course. There must be a conscience for it. But it's whether that conscience is one which is good and honourable, or whether it's pricked. So, yeah, I do think there must be a conscience about the decisions that are made at Westminster. It's how those decisions are lived out and worked out in the end by those who maybe oppose the views that are agreed, which makes the difference. And therefore, we may see consciences pricked in different ways. So, in broad terms, I think, yes, there must be a conscience about the decisions that are made, but what is that conscience?
Thank you very much. Joe?
It's difficult. I think perhaps if you'd have asked me before I'd listened to Sir Stephen, maybe I'd have said no. But I've been greatly filled with hope being here tonight, that we have people like Sir Stephen acting on our behalf. And it's difficult because obviously individuals have a conscience, don't they? But we, as Andy said, each individual's conscience is different, and I guess we can only hope that the individuals have a conscience who are thinking about the welfare of others. You know, put together, there's enough of them to have a majority, really. But I would like to hope.
Thank you, Stephen.
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand the question, whether it's a conscience in relation to Christianity or a sort of conscience...
Well, it says with regard to some of the decisions made.
Yeah.
Well, is that in a sense of when things have apparently gone wrong, maybe? Are people honest about it? Yeah, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think all I would say is that there are a lot of people in Westminster, a lot of members of Parliament on all sides who are definitely people of conscience. That's reflected, I'm sure the way everybody votes is reflected, reflects their conscientious view, and part of that is wanting to support colleagues, and therefore not necessarily voting for the first thing that comes into your mind, but being willing to support your party colleagues, sometimes in rather difficult situations. But will there be a conscience? There's going to be an election before very long. Things will change. I'm sure that a large number of conscientious people will be elected again. But quite what form their conscience takes will depend on who's elected. So yeah, it's certainly. I think it would be quite unfair to say that Westminster is a sort of conscience-free zone or anything of that kind. But of course, it does depend who's there, how precisely that conscience is expressed.
Thank you. And I think we're going to make this the last one. My apologies to those I haven't been able to cover. There are quite a lot that are left. A lot of them revolve specifically around life at Westminster. And I thought that might end up with just you answering for a very long time, Stephen. Things like, how many Labour MPs are Christians, how many Tory ones are Christians, and you get opportunities to pray and all sorts, which are very interesting stuff. But it might be just too specific and targeted.
We might have to do that by email, perhaps, or.
Yeah, well, that'd be interesting, yeah. I could send you those. We might be able to get some, I don't know how we publicise, we'll work it out. So we'll make this the last one, I think, because we do want to end on time. And this is from Erica. Where's Erica? I lost Erica. Thank you, Erica. As we move away from the pandemic, how do you think, as Christians or churches, we can best influence politics and politicians? I think there's a little bit of overlap here with some of the others, and I know Stephen's been very upfront about getting involved with politics and politicians, but I guess not everyone can do that. So as we move away from the pandemic, when there seems to have been a greater partnership approach and respect maybe, how do you think as Christians or churches we can best influence politics and politicians? So I think we'll start with Joe, if that's all right.
I don't really know the answer. As I said, I think when there was a fairly similar question. But as I said before, I think, we are quite a powerful force as the church. There's a lot of us. And I think for individual churches, I think if we're working in a particular area, I don't want to keep talking about asylum seekers just because that's the area I'm working with, but obviously as a church, the people you're working with, that the heart that you have in your communities and the issues it's facing. I think trying to find creative ways. Andy, I hope you don't mind me saying, but encouraged churches to send their palm crosses to Number 10 and encourage ministers in peace in acting for peace across the world. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict at the moment. And it seems like a really small act, doesn't it? But it makes people take notice. And I think when we work together, we can think of creative ways to make people take notice about these issues. And like I said, I don't know what those are, but I think when we come together corporately and have those conversations, I think that's the place to begin.
Thank you. Stephen?
I think the answer is to go and talk to the politicians. So we've got three politicians here tonight, me, Catherine, Jed, and I think sometimes people in churches kind of feel, well, politicians are very busy people, don't want to give them even more work to do, but actually politicians do want to hear from people in churches, to be invited to events like this and the kind of things that this church is doing in the community. That's a positive thing from a politician's point of view. So don't hold back, go and talk to them, and if you disagree with them, tell them that as well, and engage and get stuck in.
Thank you. And Andy, last word on this question to you.
Thank you. I think it's about living out our lives as Christ would choose and allowing that to be obvious in who we are and what we do. And engaging, as Sir Stephen has just said, engaging with our politicians and MPs and inviting them in, helping them to be part of who we are. You quoted one of my favourite theologians earlier, Sir Stephen, Tom Wright. I'm going to quote one of my favourite theologians and songwriters who no one has heard of, Elaine Buckley, a dear friend who died last week. And she wrote these words: "He's building a special kingdom. It's about God. He wants me to help him to build a place down here like he's got up in heaven, where empty hearts can be filled." And I believe that's what politicians want as much as what we Christians want. Invite them in.
Thank you very much. Stephen, Joe, Andy, thank you so much for all that you've offered tonight in different ways. Thank you, everyone here that's submitted questions, being here to listen, being here to take part, being here to meet one another. Thank you so much. But would you give a hearty round of applause here?